All right, so we are going to say if angle A is congruent to angle D, and then this side that's right next to it, AB, is congruent to side DE, and the angle B is congruent to angle E, then we can say that the two triangles are congruent by angle side angle. So we've got triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Now I want you guys to be careful because I saw it on the quiz. You want to make sure that your angles are matching the congruencies. So if you look Q, so our first statement is that SQ bisects angle RQT and angle RST. And I'm getting that straight from there. And the reason is because it's given. Now let's apply that given information to our image. So we're saying that this segment right here is bisecting this angle and this angle. So when it bisects, what does that mean? I'm sorry? It cuts it into two equal parts, right? Cuts into two equal parts, which means that this angle is going to be congruent to this one. Let's make my picture bigger. Notice I'm only using one arc, so it can identify which one it's congruent to. And then this angle, where I'm using two arcs, will be congruent to this angle. All right, so let's go ahead and write those things down, where we can say that angle RQS is congruent to angle SQT. Grab that paper. And how do we know they're congruent? What definition are we using to determine that those two are congruent? How do we know those two angles are congruent? Because they're what? Bisecting, right? And bisecting means that it's going to cut that angle into two equal parts. So because of the definition of bisector, we can say that those two angles are congruent. And now if we look at these two angles, we can say that angle RSQ, this is RSQ, is congruent to angle TSQ. Again, because of the definition of bisector. Because notice how it's bisecting these two bigger angles. What other information do we know about this triangle? These ones? Yeah. So can we say that QS is congruent to QS? Yes, of course. So we're going to say on this one, QS is congruent to segment QS. And we know that because of what property? Does anybody remember the name of that property? Yes, perfect. Reflexive property. All right, so now that we have reflexive property here, now we're going to see if we can incorporate our postulate. So here we have a side, this is an angle, that's congruent to this angle. Right next to it, we have this side congruent to this side. Right next to that, we have this angle congruent to this angle. So because we have an angle, a side, and an angle congruent to the other triangle, then we can say that those two triangles are congruent. Triangle QRS is congruent to triangle QTS by the angle, side, angle postulate. Okay, let's go to the next one. Those of you at home, if you can write this down, angle, angle, side. So now we have two angles and a side. And again, notice in all our congruency postulates, we always have a side that needs to be congruent. Those of you at home, let's go ahead and write angle, angle, side. And on this one, if we have two angles, and a non-included side, meaning that side is not in between the two angles, of one triangle are congruent to the two angles and the non-included side of another triangle, then the triangles not included are congruent. So go ahead and mark that down. Those of you that have the paper, take off are included and put congruent. It was a typo. Adolfo, Adolfo, come on, we're taking notes, sweetheart. We're taking notes. Are you writing the stuff down? Huh? Put your phone in your bag. Come on, in your bag. I want you to be successful, sweetheart. Do you need a pencil? You got one? Perfect. All right. So when we talk about angle, angle, side, then we have congruent to EF. Then we can say that the two triangles are congruent. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF by the angle, angle, side postulate. So if you have two angles right next to each other and then a side congruent, then those two triangles are congruent by the angle, angle, side. Let's go ahead and prove this one really quick. So those of you at home, if you can start writing this part down, and I'll upload these notes as soon as we're done. So if you miss a little piece, don't worry, it'll be uploaded. All right, let's write down our two columns, statement column and our reason column. And on your test, whenever you have your statement and your reason, it'll be like the assignment that you did last week or 2 weeks ago, where you'll have a pull down menu and then you get to choose what the reason is or what the statement would be. All right, so we have YZ, let's write that down, bisects angle WYX. So let's look at WYX, and it's telling us that YZ is bisecting it. What does that mean about those two angles? If YZ bisects it, that means that this angle is congruent to this angle, right? Because this is my bisector. So let's go ahead and put given for this one. And because that is our bisector, then we can say, statement 2, that angle WYZ is congruent to angle XYZ. And we know that because of the definition of our bisector. Let's look at the next statement that's given. We've got angle YWZ is congruent to angle YXZ. So YWZ, so this angle, so we're going to use two tick marks now because we used the other one. We used one for the other ones. And then YXZ is the congruent angle. And how do we know that? Because the information is given. And that's all the information given. But if we look at our picture or our diagram, what else do we know is congruent? Yes. YZ, right? YZ is congruent to what? YZ. So we've got YZ is congruent to YZ, and we know that because of my reflexive property. All right, so here we go. We've got this side congruent to this side. I'm sorry, that's not a side, that's an angle. Miss Silva, coffee's not kicking in. We've got this, oops. I tell you, I have the Monday blues today. Well, not the blues, but just the Monday feels. So this angle is congruent to this angle. And then we have this angle that's next to it congruent to this angle that's next to it. And then we have this side congruent to this side. So because we have two angles and a non-included side congruent to the other two angles and the non-included side, then we can say that these two triangles are congruent. So WYZ is congruent to triangle XYZ because of our angle, angle, side postulate. All right, so when we're looking at postulates, go ahead and draw them. Here you have them on the back of your paper. And let's start with the first angles that we know are congruent. So we've got this angle we know is congruent to this angle. Then we have a side that's next to it that's congruent to this side. So I'm going to put side here and side here. And I'm going to put a little arrow to help me remember the order. After that, this angle, we don't know if it's congruent to this one, so we're going to skip it. And then we know that this side is congruent to this side. Have we learned a postulate where we have angle side side? We haven't, right? What does it spell? Don't say it out loud. And we'll learn why that postulate will never work. And we'll learn that on Wednesday. But anytime it says the bad word, that's a bad, no postulate. It will not work. So this one does not have enough information. So we can't say they're congruent because we don't have enough information to prove that they're congruent. So we don't know. So it's not enough information. Let's go to number 2. Now remember, we want to look at any of the vocabulary words that we learned before. And notice how we have a nice little X right here for my vertical angles. So I can say that these two angles are congruent because of the vertical angles theorem. Or I'm sorry, the definition of vertical angles. So here we go. This side, Luke, this is important, sweetheart, is congruent to this side. How do we know they're congruent? Because they each have 2 tick marks. Now let's look for the closest angular side that is also congruent. This angle is the one next to it, and it's congruent to this angle that is right next to it as well. Then right next to that, we have this side, and that side is congruent to this side. So can we say that these two triangles are congruent? Yes, by what postulate? Perfect, my side angle side postulate. Okay, let's look at the next one. Number 3. All right, we see that they're sharing a side. So let's go ahead and put that they're congruent already. And I'm going to put 1 tick mark on it to show that they're congruent to itself. All right, so let's start this off. We've got this side congruent to this side. We don't have an angle that's near it congruent, so we skip to the side. So let's say, I don't know, I'm going to go to this side. This side is congruent to this side. And remember, it has to be the exact same order. Then we have this side congruent to this side. So can we say those two triangles are congruent? Yes. By what postulate? It tells us, right? It's our side, side, side. Let's go to number 4. Again, we see a nice X. We have our vertical angles, so let's go ahead and put those two angles congruent to each other. All right, so let's start with this 90-degree angle. This angle is congruent to this one. And then we look at for the nearest side or angle that's congruent without skipping both. So we've got this side congruent to this side. And then we have this angle, that's the nearest congruent, see? Congruent to that one. So can we say the two triangles are congruent? Yes. And we can say that by what postulate? Perfect. Angle, side, angle. And let's go ahead and do the last one. There we have an X again. Let's put our congruency marks, but this time we have to use 2 because one's already being used by this angle. We don't want to confuse them. So I'm going to start with this side. Oops. This side is congruent to this side. Then we have the angle right next to it. And that one has 2 tick marks. This one has 2, so it's going to be congruent to that one. And then we've got this angle congruent to this angle. So can we say those two triangles are congruent? Yes. By what postulate? The opposite? Angle, angle, side. Yes.